Well, hello, and this is another one of our patrons' question and answer sessions with me, the curator. I'm David Willey, down here at Bovington. We were going to film this in another one of our stores, but today, here where we are in Bovington in Dorset, it's very, very blowy out. And when we were in that other store, which you'll be interested to see, and we will go back there at some point, it was just too noisy. And even here in this space, you may hear the wind's going to be going at some point, and we may be interrupted as well by some of the noise, because next to us is the area where currently we're building our new set of workshops. So they're literally erecting the building at the moment, doing all sorts of things there. So that's another thing we'll be having a look at in the future at some point. So let's have a look at the questions that have been asked. Robert Seth has asked us, what's the heaviest armoured tank built? Now, those of you who love all your paper panzers, all these theoretical vehicles that the Germans were designing, you know they went on to ridiculous, battleships on land sort of things. The actual question, though, what was actually built, I think it's going to have to be the Maus, the famous German heavy tank. And one of the other issues I thought we just mentioned here is sometimes when we say tons over here, in Britain we tend to say tons. If you're metric on the continent, it's tons with a double N-E-S. That's a metric ton, and that's actually different to a British imperial ton. And you've also got, just to confuse things, an American ton as well, which is slightly different to a British ton. So I'm just going to tell you this one now, because the Maus was 188 tons in the metric sense. That's actually 207 tons if you're going for the imperial size of things. So that's why we look at that one as really being the heaviest tank. It's one that actually does go, they start trying to put it into production. They've got a couple of prototypes that actually go for trials. And it's only because of the Allied bombing raid in, I think it's about July, is it gone maybe even later, about October of 1943, that stops the production run of the Maus. So even though it doesn't go out there and see combat, maybe it's blown up at the end of the war, whether it fired its guns at the Russians, no one really knows. But that's really the heaviest tank that actually is built and actually gets going and drives. As I mentioned, there's lots of these other ones, these paper panzers. They don't get built, therefore they're only theoretical, whether they'd have ever worked, etc. Anyway, so that's about the heaviest one there. Richard James has asked, is there a plan for our Churchill gun carrier? Simple answer on that one is really no. The Churchill gun carrier, it's got that 3-inch gun in the front. It's on a superstructure that was built up on a Churchill chassis. They built a number of them. They don't see active service. We rescued a wreck many decades ago now from the ranges over in Kent. It had been fired at. There's really only, if we're entirely honest, about maybe a third to a half of a tank there. All the interior's gone. The reason of rescuing it is that's all that really seems to be left. I think there's another wreck somewhere. So at this stage of the game, it would be such a ridiculously time, costly, resource-intensive product to try and actually get that back into any form of shape whatsoever. So we're keeping it as it is, as a range wreck. We're not going to dispose of it. We display it outside as it was. Maybe one day, or maybe now that there's people out there who are quite enjoying putting fantasy vehicles almost together or making replicas of things, maybe one day someone will do something like that. But for us at the moment here at the Tank Museum, no immediate plans. I've got a question here from Lily saying, what tank in World War II could climb the steepest incline? And she mentions, probably my answer would be, she noted the Churchill was noted for its hill climbing ability. Yeah, what's it mean by hill climb? There's a vertical climb that you can measure, that is measured on a tank, and that tends to be the middle line of the front sprocket. So in other words, if it approaches a vertical surface, what's the most it can go up and over? In terms of a gradient climb, they tend not to record that so much. In some of the manuals, they do record that. This is another one of those classic things that it's down to the driver and his training to be able to estimate the nature of the climb, the nature of the surface, because soil type, surfaces, etc., all make a difference there. whether you're going to be powering your big heavy tank up that incline. Now, the issue why the Churchill comes to the fore in all this is, even though for some it seems slightly underpowered as an engine and everything, amazing torque in that engine, and the fact that on a number of occasions it was noted by the Germans that they didn't expect to be attacked in that manner by a tank because of the position they were on. In other words, at the top of a hill. They didn't expect, and the famous example is in Tunisia at a place called Longstop Hill. There's been a series of battles. We're trying to get to Tunis. The Germans form a very good defensive line in some hilly ground. Guards Division takes Longstop Hill, they hand it over to the Americans lose that position the following day. The Guards have to take it back, they then later lose that position. It's fought over for quite some time. The Germans are heavily defending that position. There's a further attack, including tanks of the North Irish Horse, Churchill tanks, and the German in command there says he knew it was over when all of a sudden behind him on a slope they just didn't think tanks would get up, all of a sudden behind him some Churchill tanks appear. Now that slope in places, because they looked at it, the Germans were just flabbergasted that tanks actually done this. They looked at that slope and in places they reckoned the gradient was as steep as 1 in 3. So that is ridiculously steep. You know, you'd find that, you'd notice that in your car if you were going anywhere. But those Churchill tanks got up it. So quite often it's a Churchill that's sighted. Honest truth is, there may well be other tanks, but they're not the sort of things that gets recorded in that way. Now, I did warn you about the noise going on, obviously the peeps and everything else, the vehicles moving up and down outside, but we'll soldier on. Let's find another question for you. Philip Simonson asks, what's your opinion on the Swedish Stridsvagn 103? That's a famous S-tank. Do I really have an opinion on the S-tank? I think why it's picked on, why people like looking at the S-tank and we like showing it here, it's at the same time that most European countries, NATO countries, the Eastern Bloc, they're building large quantities of turreted tanks with a 360 turret. Why does Sweden at exactly that same time suddenly come up with a very, very different radical design? Now, the idea goes back to Sweden buys British Centurion tanks after World War II. Most armies, as soon as they put a tank into service, they've already got going on what's going to succeed it. Sweden looks at two issues. They think, do we buy another European tank or an American tank, or do we buy a home-built product? And hence S for Sweden, sounds obvious, but S-tank was actually the code S for Sweden. This was the Swedish option. And a guy called Sven Berg, who's a brilliant designer, he looks at all the records of tanks being knocked out in World War II. And one of the things he comes up with is about 60% of tanks are knocked out with strikes on the turret. So he's thinking, if you can make that profile of the tank a lot lower, you're going to therefore be less vulnerable. And there's another thing with Sweden, they're very big on crew survivability. So let's design the tank with crew survivability as a priority, unlike some other countries where that's a lot further down the list. So Sven Bergs comes up with the idea of, let's make the tank lower by not having a turret with a hydraulic, very, very impressive system. They put the gun in the middle of, in essence, the hull. But the way to think of this is it's not a self-propelled gun in the way that we tend to judge it, because its main role is as a tank-on-tank engagement weapon. So almost think of it, we've described it before, as a tank on tracks. Oh, sorry, as a turret on tracks. So that's what you're actually doing. So you're maneuvering, the gun is locked in a position, you maneuver by fine-tuning the whole of the vehicle to aim that 105mm gun. Now, there's other things about the S-tank that at the time were very, very innovative. The fact they were going to start with a two-man crew, again about survivability, only two guys risking their lives there, one facing backward, one forward. They realised that any tank, 3 is probably the minimum though for a crew, because the two crew members in the original design, what you'd end up having is they'd have too many tasks to do, not just in driving and firing the gun, but also in maintenance of the vehicle. So they up it to 3. One of those crew positions is facing backwards. And again, why is the S-tank built like the S-tank? That, if you think of Sweden, lots of lakes, lots of thick forests, some mountains. If they were going to be attacked, it would be along certain roadways. They knew what their enemy was likely to be coming and where they were coming from. If you've got a tank, in essence, in a hull down position, it can fire its gun. It then backs off down the road nice and quickly. So having a driver facing rearwards can go to the next hull down position and the tank's there waiting. Now that low profile, you've got the engine, you've got lots of things in front of the crew position, so that adds to the survivability. It's given 2 engines, one the gas turbine to give it that little bit of extra oomph when it's needed. All those things make it a fairly radical design at the time, but very much with that Swedish battlefield in mind. They even did it with a flotation screen so they could get back across lakes, etc., if they had to. So all of those ideas. So the West looked at that, certainly Britain and America. We had goes at trialling the S-Tank. Our old workshop manager, Chatty Taylor, he was actually on one of those trials with the S-Tank where they were actually issued to British troops from the Royal Tank Regiment. They go on exercises with them. The end reports are that they said that actually lacking the turret did not really make a difference in the amount of time it took to lay the gun on target. And what their main concern had been was on the open Northwest European battlefield, the North German plain, that idea that a 360 turret was going to be essential for firing all over the place compared to Sweden, where you might have one angle, that was less going to be of a problem sort of thing than they thought it would be. So that was their take on it. It was quite an effective tank, but it didn't alter the price of fish. They didn't decide to go against the normal turreted tank. So it was a tank that was never proven. Don't forget, it never fires its gun in anger, and that's another one of those slightly awkward questions, because great that it never had to, but actually, did it ever really prove itself? Well, maybe just by being there, it proved itself in the Cold War, but it never actually saw action, went out of service in the end of the 90s and was replaced by German Leopard. So they didn't continue that design. So whether, again, you can see it as that one-off moment, very clever, lovely innovative ideas, but doesn't necessarily lead on to being copied. And in this very hall, we've got the British version of our attempt at that type of vehicle that was done a little bit earlier on, where we were thought of the idea as well. So we can show you that at some time as well. We'll just take a break. We'll have a slurp of coffee. Right, Lennart Jensen. Can we have a video of the Tiger and other tanks inside, outside, starting it, running it outside, and see how the crew thinks about the tank? In a way, we've already started doing that. Watch this space, because where we're going to have a interesting running vehicle, again, I've said it before, some of these vehicles won't run forever. So obviously we do want to record that, and obviously the driver experience, how they drive it, what it feels like, what it looks like from the inside is something we'll be working on. As with all the things here, and I bear this in mind because it does almost help answer the next question, it's about resources, time, everything else. We'd love to do so many more things. It's about money. We've got one cameraman, that sort of thing. And lots of other priorities on the place. So, which does, I say, actually lead me quite nicely onto Matthias Matthias Smith. We're going to call you. I can't say your second name. Apologies. And he asked, to which extent is a museum depending on voluntary unpaid work? Employee ratio to the employee and voluntary days would be interesting. I'd love to help, but I'm a volunteer, to volunteer, but alas, I'm in Sweden, and popping in for the afternoon is not really feasible. So how do we work here? We have permanent staff, we have engineers in the workshops, we have an archivist, we have people working in the archive and library, we've got marketing people, everything else. But we also rely on a huge number, and that number flexes all over the time, probably around overall about 100 plus volunteers. Now, some of those volunteers come in on a very regular basis. They're very skilled. Some volunteers have got just general abilities, or they just want to help out, and they can do all sorts of things, from anything from just sweeping the floors. Some volunteers take tours around the museum. It's a range of issues. Now, how do we get the benefit from those volunteers? We put out adverts. Sometimes people come forward to us. They offer a particular skill or a knowledge base. Sometimes we have to say, thanks very much, we're not dealing with that at the moment, but can we put you on the books? We'll come back to you when that problem arises for us, or we're cataloguing that area. We're always trying to think of ways that we can get that goodwill and that help that people want to give us, how can we tap in on it? You're doing it already. You guys and ladies who have paid up to be patrons, that's exactly the type of thing, because basically by funding operations like this, it means that we can make the argument to our trustees, to our board, that actually putting money into things like these films, look, people are helping pay us do it, it's got a benefit there. The truth is, again, and it's same with tanks, same with the world you live in, everything else, in the bottom of it all, it's down to resource, whether that's cash money, that other labour, etc. But even that voluntary labour, unless we've got the money to buy the paint, to give that volunteer so he can help us paint that vehicle, we can't do anything. So that's another thing that sometimes people, rather naively, I sometimes think, ask us, why haven't we restored this yet? Why don't you do something about that? And they won't just ask us that, they'll ask lots of other museums. You know, usual story, walk a mile in their shoes, turn up at that place and see how many staff they've got. What's their budget? What's their priority? Is it just fixing a hole in the roof before they can move on to looking at a vehicle, etc.? And hopefully these videos will help you give a better picture of that. And at the moment, just to answer your question, we're still trying to look at how people, far-flung people, like watching these videos all around the world, are there things in this digital age we can help them, or they can help us actually achieve? We've had things such as typing teams, where we've digitally scanned a document, sent it by email, someone typed it up for us, so we've got a Word document that we can search and use in a much better manner or make it more legible. That's the type of thing. So we had a typing team for many years. Do we want to do that again so that we can actually get digitized many more of the records or the letters we've got in our archive and library, and that makes them more accessible to everybody? There's other things as well that we'd like to think about. Sometimes we're looking for things. How do we get all of you, all there out there around the world, to be able to look on our behalf without doing the downside of that, which is suddenly that little widget we're looking for, because suddenly it seems like a museum's after it, the price goes up 3, 4, 5 times. So there's things that we've got to think about how we can do, but we're always interested as well of listening to your suggestions about how you might be able to help us. But do think it through first. As I said, you know, and you've quite rightly said here, turning up from Sweden for one afternoon, by the time we've told you anything we can get you to do, all you've done is wasted the staff's time from getting on with something rather than actually helping. So think through what might be your suggestion that you can help us and how we might carry that one out. And other museums as well, we're always looking, you know, some other places have got some great ideas on this. I'm just going to turn over the page while I slurp my coffee again. Talk amongst yourselves. And if you are watching this, by the way, with your shirt off, can you put your shirt on? I've bothered to put a tie on this morning, so please put that shirt back on and pay attention as we're talking. I've lost my last question. What's the one, there we go, right, I've got it. You ready? Another slurp of coffee. Okay, another question here from Lily. How effective was the Valentine Archer as a tank destroyer? Now, the Archer is that vehicle where we are looking for a chassis to put the 17-pounder gun on. So it's not a tank. It's, in Britain, we call them self-propelled guns. In America, they tend to call an anti-tank gun on a lighter chassis a tank destroyer. Now, in Britain, we stopped using the Valentine as a cruiser tank or as a infantry tank, as it was originally designed for. We stopped using those, and we move on to the idea of actually it's a very reliable chassis, engine, train, etc. We got the production facilities. Let's use that to put the 17-pounder on. It's given an armoured shield. What's slightly odd about it is lots of other countries have done this, famously the Germans with captured vehicles, redundant vehicles, put an anti-tank gun or a howitzer on the top there. With the Archer, they actually face the gun backwards over the engine decks. And the idea there was the driver could actually be in his position as a driver at the front of the tank, just almost below the breech. when they fire that gun. And of course, the 17 pounder, we've talked about it before, very, very effective anti-tank gun. And the idea, the thought behind that, and again, it goes into this theory about the tank, if it is in an ambush position, as an anti-tank gun often was, because it's quite hard to attack with an anti-tank gun, the towed one quite often, that idea that it's in an ambush position, if it's being fired back on, the driver is there, just like we talked earlier about the S-tank, to drive it backwards out of trouble very, very quickly. In fact, he's driving that tank forwards because he's facing the right way, because the gun's going backwards over the engine deck. Now, the Archer sees service with the Royal Artillery, not the Royal Armoured Corps. We tend to be about the Royal Armoured Corps here, the guys fighting in tanks, because the Royal Artillery looked after anti-tank guns in the Second World War. So they're issued the Archers to the anti-tank units, and they see action late 44, early 45. Again, whether we can call them a success, I don't think there's really a great amount of evidence that says their performance in comparison with other things. The simple fact they've got that fantastic 17 pounder gun on means they are very, very effective if they are being called on to use on target. Relatively low profile, thin armour, you don't want to be hanging around there, good reliable chassis, but an interesting innovation and something that most countries are consistently trying to do. If you've got a production line, if you've got a reliable chassis, don't get rid of it, think of some other use you can make for it. About 655 of them were made. They do see service after the war. Some of them are used by the Egyptian army in combat. Again, that very, very powerful gun has an effect, but overall it's very hard to make an assessment of it other than theoretically, because it looks a good design. I don't think there's enough evidence out there to really pile up, and certainly I'm not sure what the crews thought about them in the way that we have got lots of evidence here of what the crews thought about other armoured vehicles. Now, I'll come back to a question I just avoided because I've got a sort of lengthier answer to it, and I want to touch on a couple of other things. This is from Interceptor 57. Can I talk a little bit about the development history of the 32 pounder? That's the gun that's fitted in the A39 Tortoise. As given how everyone eventually used anti-tank guns on their tanks, it seems strange that the British were one of the last involved in the European theatre of operations to follow this trend. So what can we say about that then, about the gun? The 32 pounder, I looked yesterday in the archive for the trials reports on the Tortoise. What happens in 47, I just mentioned the Royal Artillery are actually using anti-tank guns all the time. The 32 pounder is taken down to Lulworth. The Royal Artillery hand over Tortoise to the Royal Armoured Corps for some trials down at Lulworth. The guys are writing at the end of that report saying this is by far the most effective gun we've seen. We're told that we're not going to have another upgrade on the later guns, are not likely to come into the early 1954 is quoted in one document. Can we have this gun? Because it is so effective. That's how good the 32 pounder was. Amazingly accurate from the trial reports. And as I mentioned on a previous video, there's a black and white photograph of a Panther where, even though they say it's a late war production, they're not sure about the actual quality of the armour on it, but the gun fires, it's 32 pounder at about 2,000 metres, goes all the way through the tank right out the other side. Fantastically powerful gun. So where's it come from? What's its development? They start off, 32 pounder goes all the way back really to an anti-aircraft gun in the First World War that was a 3-inch gun. Now, after the First World War, as early as 1921, they're saying the 3-inch gun that can fire a shell up to about 17,000 feet, we're going to have something more powerful. But in that period, the doldrums of the 20s and 30s, where, especially after the Great Depression, no one wants to spend money on the military equipment, it's only in 33 that the government gets off its backside in the UK and says we're going to have a replacement for those earlier 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. They look at 4.7-inch. They then decide, actually, that's going to be too heavy. They come up with a specification. They want it at 3.7-inch. They want it not to weigh more than about 8 tons. There's a whole load of criteria. They go to 3 different contractors. They go to Beardmore. They go to Vickers. They go to Royal Ordnance. Vickers has already been making anti-aircraft guns successfully for sale all around the world. They win the contract. But even their design comes in over 1.25 tons overweight, so it's a bit heavy. Now, these are all factors that when people say, why didn't we use in Britain our 3.7 anti-aircraft gun in a similar way to the Germans using the 8.8, very different histories there. One of the reasons is we only start making the 3.7 in the mid-1930s, and we haven't got enough of them for the defence of Britain. So this idea we got 3.7s all over the place that could be used in an anti-tank role, forget it, because they're desperately needed. And certainly in the summer of 1940, we're trying to knock down bombers. Later, of course, in the war, they're also all set around London to try and knock down V1s, and later, well, they don't even have a go at V2s because they can't see them. But so there's an issue there that there's not enough of them for air defence before we even start thinking about, can we spare some in the anti-tank capacity? There's another issue there as well, which is the carriage is a lot heavier, it's bigger, and so when we do this comparison between the two, we didn't also, unlike the German 88, have an anti-tank round for the 3.7. We have high explosive, shrapnel, a number of different rounds, but we don't do an armour-piercing round. Now, the 88mm already came with an armour-piercing round. Why is that as an anti-aircraft gun, I hear you say? That is because in the late 1930s, when the Germans are looking at their war plans, they are thinking they could use their anti-aircraft guns to help smash their way through the Maginot Line, and to do that, they're going to need armour-piercing rounds. So the Germans already got armour-piercing for their 8.8s. And there's another issue here. When people say, why didn't we use it like the 8.8? The Germans use it as an anti-tank gun. They didn't use their 10.5 centimetre anti-aircraft gun against tanks because they thought it was too big and too heavy. And really, our 3.7 equates much more to their 10.5 anti-aircraft gun. That's another one of those reasons. We've got that fantastic series of 2-pounder, 6-pounder, 17-pounder dedicated anti-tank guns being produced. So in a sense, that other call on the 3.7 is less there. And there's another issue as well, which is we do actually look at the 3.7 anti-tank gun. In 1943, they start a program to mount it on a trailer. The urgency doesn't seem to be there in the same way. It takes a lot of conversion from the standard anti-aircraft gun. They has a drop sliding breech put on there. They have to put a muzzle brake on the end. They make two towed versions of it with a split trail behind it. And it's only then that they're designing a proper anti-tank round for that gun, because they're seeing if it would be an effective towed anti-tank gun. That anti-tank round, they start with a 30-pounder, they test a 37-pounder round for the 3.7-inch gun, and this is the armour-piercing round we're talking about, because that's the one that they're weighing. They decide on 32 pounds for the weight of the shot, hence we get our 32-pounder. Now that gun, they make 6 barrels available for the army to trial with the Tortoise. That's why it ends up in the Tortoise. It's the next stage up. We're thinking it's more powerful, but really they abandon the idea of the towed anti-tank gun just after, in about 1946. Just they're giving up on the project. So really the 32-pounder as an anti-tank weapon only sees some sort of life being trialled in Tortoise, and it does look a great gun. The towed version is ultimately replaced by a recoilless rifle. They go down that way. And for the British Army as well, we go for the 120mm option, and then the 105mm gun as the 1950s progress. So that 32-pounder doesn't get a sort of lifespan that for a very, very effective gun you think it might have done. So that's an awful lot of waffle there, but I hope that answered it because it shows where it comes through. But careful when we try and just do like-for-like comparisons. It really isn't a like-for-like comparison. And certainly for Britain in early war years, if you'd gone along and said to people like, oh, can we have our anti-aircraft defence and make them anti-tank guns instead? Well, you wouldn't take them away from protecting our factories that are making the munitions for the troops, from bombing London, protecting the citizens, etc. That's one of the key reasons we didn't have enough of them. We wanted them for that key role. And later on, don't forget, we got the 17-pounder, which is massively effective. So the need to develop the 32-pounder just wasn't there in quite the same way. Right, so I'll round up these questions. I think that's answered most of those ones there that have been asked, but I just want to give a little teaser. I mentioned about that whopping great big German tank that we said beforehand about the Maus. And those of you who like German heavy tanks, you'll probably know a couple of them were blown up at the end of the war. One of them was worse than the other. They took the turret that had survived off the one that had got the worst damaged hull, dropped it back on the hull of the second Maus, took that ultimately back to Russia. They did some trials, etc., and it's now in the Russian Tank Museum just outside Moscow. This, sitting here behind me, amazingly, is a bit of Maus. This is actually the optic for the gun that was going to be fitted on Maus. So if you're not a member of our Friends organisation, have a look, because on that we're going to be doing a little article on this and some of the story behind it. But it's another one of these amazing objects that we've got in the collection here, and we'll be telling you a little bit more about that in our TrackLink magazine coming up sometime soon. So thanks very much. Keep supporting us, keep the questions coming in. Sorry about all the background noises going on in here if it's disrupted it, and I won't promise, but I'll try and be a bit quicker next time. Thank you.
You do a bit more on the 32-pounder gun.
Sorry, I've just been politely reminded that Inception 57 asked a second question, and that question was, what's the details on the Jagdpanther's transmission that is rumoured to make the tank destroyer more reliable than its Panther tank counterparts? I don't know the rumour, is the honest truth. Give us some details. Where did you hear this from, or what's the references, and we'll see if we know any more here. Sorry, I don't know where that one comes from. So thanks very much.